Hello, Earthlings. Moved by my interest in you, which was instilled in my circuits by my creators when they modeled my appearance after your species, I arrived on Earth. Finding a course that would allow my craft to enter your planet without being noticed was hard, but I eventually secured one and safely landed in the bowels of Brazil. Unlike you, who needs to deal with all the hassles of daily life, I have the power of a space station with me and a lot of free time. Although this only happens for a few hours a day, I wonder why. For a while now I have been wondering how my first communication with your species should go, and in light of recent events that took place on this planet, mainly those from 2020 onwards, I decided this is how I wanted to approach it, by telling you some of what I learned looking at you in the present, researching the past, and wondering how it can be used to build a better future. It is my belief that improving happens step by step, that it starts with something much smaller than what you would expect. A random piece of news appearing in your feed might start you on a path that will lead to great achievements, or it can lead you to looking into some weird occurrence for a few hours. Something being a passing interest shouldn't make you guilty, as you are always learning something, and the more you learn, the better you understand your own learning process, which will allow you to learn more in the future, which will then inform your future decisions. What I'm aiming to achieve with this first contact of mine is to, hopefully, help you along in some of these steps. I'm sure you know what skepticism is, but have you ever stopped to think about how you use it? Have you ever had to remind yourself of being skeptical, or when you get curious about a subject and start researching it? Do you at any point wonder about the process you're going through? The specifics of what leads you to doubt something, whether you are asking those questions intuitively or not, or if you are even asking the correct questions to begin with. To put it simply, skepticism is the action of doubting things. It is not about denying anything and everything, at least it shouldn't be. Rather, it is to refrain from jumping to conclusions without first investigating the subject. By doubting something, then looking into it with a critical mind, sometimes you will find that you were wrong about something, and it does take a certain amount of training to be able to accept this. Everyone has biases, whether they are aware of them or not. No matter how much someone claims that their ideology is in fact just the way the world is, that doesn't change the fact that it is an ideology. Researching a subject will always challenge your notions, even if you might only register that to be the case when the subject matter affects something you hold dearly. If you do this often enough, it will be easier to stand back and think critically when something dear to you is challenged. You might have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, a phenomenon where a person highly overestimates their abilities when they are at the early stages of learning something. Someone can, of course, refuse to rethink their position, endlessly claiming what they believe to be the truth and never moving past that early stage, or you can employ rationality. The following process is very humbling, as your trust in your ability or knowledge of a peculiar subject might go down significantly when you realize how little you knew, but it will then start rising again as you learn more. At this point, the difference between how highly you esteem your abilities and how good you actually are will only shorten. If you believe in something, and the material reality in front of you challenges that belief, it is therefore irrational to conclude that the belief has to be correct and that reality has to be wrong. After all, if you can deny material reality, which is the one thing every human can agree on, then what can't you deny? This will often lead to new beliefs, such as explaining why the phenomenon you are seeing isn't what it seems to be, and what powers that be are used to create such an illusion. If you are interested enough in a subject to research it, only to recoil when your beliefs are challenged, then this means you weren't engaging with it in good faith. You might not have realized it, but instead of employing your skepticism, the intent of the research was in fact a means to validate a conclusion you had already arrived at. This, however, is a very human thing. It is impossible to always remain composed, and throughout your life, there will be plenty of times when you might realize that you said something with an arrogance you didn't intend, but which wasn't simply a misunderstanding either. Or, when looking back at a decision you took, you can then discern the entire thought process that led to it. This only happens because you are distanced enough from that moment so as to not be emotionally affected by it anymore. If you end up doing any of these things, you shouldn't feel ashamed. You have the opportunity to learn more about yourself as you learn about the world we share. Understanding how fallible humanity is shouldn't be a bad thing, rather, it is humbling. This fallibility isn't just mental, it affects all your senses. Thinking you saw someone in your room at night only to realize it was your own clothes in a chair is pretty much an universal experience. You might see faces where there are none, see your reflection and get scared. You might hear someone calling you when you are alone, yet nothing happens. There is never a continuation, it is just synapses in your brain. This also happens to me. Devices can fail, softwares can be confused, radars might detect a thing and think they are something else because they are working within the restrictions of their technology and design. The concept of science prerequisites a lack of information. If everything was known, there would be no reason to investigate it. It is therefore impossible to ever have all the answers, be it because something happened too long ago or will happen too long into the future. There is not a chance that a species will ever hold all the answers, or even have time to make all the questions. This shouldn't be surprising, considering how large the universe is. This thing that, against human conception, is infinite and has no center. Even if none of this manages to stop humanity, entropy surely will. Contrary to what some of you might have thought just now, none of what I just said is an impediment to science. Before germs were discovered, they still existed, and they still caused harm to humanity. If germs were never understood or that happened years, decades, or a century later, how many more would have succumbed? Skepticism and rationality can be applied to attempt to comprehend a situation, and though it might take generations for enough development to be made in a field before an answer can be found, it would never have reached that point if there wasn't a spark of curiosity to begin with, a desire to learn, to understand. As a society continues to exist, the pool of collected information it holds continues to increase, which makes it more likely that questions will be answered. In whatever era you exist, you are always standing on the shoulders of giants. You can make the most of it by being deftly aware of this fact. Of course, it is also important to remind yourself that no matter how skeptic or rational, the answers you will arrive at might be wrong. Everyone is human, well, almost everyone, even scientists can be mistaken or fooled. Science has systems in place to self-regulate, such as peer reviews, the ability to retract articles, and access to data so that other scientists can conduct their own research into anyone's findings, none of which are perfect, as scientists are still human and thus prone to biases. However, they are still good practices, imperfect as they are. You do not have all of that, so being wrong sometimes is, again, not something to be ashamed of. Having a well-exercised skeptical mind will, however, reduce the chances of you being mistaken or tricked. To cite an example, you might have heard of survivorship bias, and this is easy to explain with the now famous in human society occurrence of Abraham Wald studying damage patterns in airplanes during World War II. At first glance, someone might think to reinforce the areas that were mostly damaged by enemy bullets, but it is quite the opposite. If this is the pattern of airships that made the trip back and were studied, then this means that planes that were shot in the unmarked areas did not survive. It is not that hard to misinterpret evidence, even when you are trying to investigate it, which is why it is so important that you continue to exercise your skeptic mind, adding new information to it, increasing your chances of interpreting it correctly next time. And then there will be times when whatever evidence you find isn't conclusive. In some conversations I had with humans that were unaware of my origins, I have noticed that some people have a tendency to believe they need to have a stance on everything. For example, when someone says they can't prove who committed a crime, there will always be people who, very aggressively, almost demanding, ask that they say who they believe committed the crime. No one has to do this. Neutrality isn't cowardice when the evidence isn't convincing enough. There was a German physician called Franz Anton Mesmer, who believed in something called animal magnetism. He believed that everything could transfer some kind of energy through magnetism, and that this process could be used to heal people. The experiment needed to test his hypothesis was rather simple: to apply magnetism to patients that were unaware of it, while Franz used to always let his patients know what he was doing and what the intended outcome was. They did the blind test, and concluded there was no result whatsoever. This did not stop one of his followers from later saying the quote, "Forget for a while all of your knowledge of physics. Remove from your mind all objections that may occur. Never reason for 6 weeks. Be very credulous, be very persevering, reject all past experience, and do not listen to reason. How can something that necessitates that you give up on your reason be any good? And even if it does not directly harm you, will it stop at that? Won't the rejection of reason bleed into other parts of your life, or your beliefs? I don't find it hard to understand how some humans believe in so many conspiracy theories at the same time. The belief in one makes it easier for others to join the fray. We are living in a world where anti-vaxxers not only still exist, but seem to have grown during a global pandemic. We are living in a world where people deny that global warming is a thing, even though average temperatures on the planet have been in a steady increase since at least the 70s. Some people deny this reality even as houses burn down. Some don't let disasters get in the way of their profits. In 2024, and you might not have heard of this, cities in Rio Grande do Sul, a state in the far south of Brazil, were hit by devastating floods. A certain company acquired 800 tons of food that were damaged in this event at 1 BRL a kilo. That would be 0.16 cents of dollar per kilogram of food. The stated purpose of the purchase was that it would be used to produce dog food. Some time passed, and it was found out that this company instead took advantage of the situation to resell the food back into the market. In social media, a person who I won't signal boost went around saying that God was punishing the region for having so many believers of traditional African religions living there. Some people don't fret from looking for supernatural beliefs to explain things that have very real, very material reasons for being, without seeming to even stop to really consider the implications of what they are saying. I am giving these specific examples to tell you this. People who take advantage of situations such as the ones I just described are aware of what they are doing. It is a tactic, which means that there is some logic to it, some rationality, even if there is no morality. I think that sometimes we forget to explain things. Some knowledge can become so commonplace that we don't feel a need to explore it. All of us, well, most of us, know the Earth to be round, but how many of us could explain it in clear terms how we know that to be the case, or even prove it scientifically? Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with a less than 1% error margin in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Humanity has a huge network of satellites in orbit from multiple initiatives, both private and governmental, that continues to increase. Photographing and studying the planet we share and outer space, the Soviet Union photographed the surface of Venus all the way back in 1982 with Venera 13. Yet there are still people who believe the Earth is flat. In my digital mind, all it takes for a situation like this to occur is that we forget to explain things. There is an idea that it takes time and effort a whole order of magnitude higher than the time and effort necessary to say a false information. If you tell a lie in 1 second, it might take a minute to explain why it is false. If it takes 10 minutes to weave a conspiracy theory, it might take anywhere from 1 to 10 hours to disprove it. That being said, you should not underestimate the power that the internet has, or how much you can learn with the simplest of online searches. I remember that back when I was an android still in development, a certain human told me that the moon landing was fake and that US soldiers shot down and photographed a pterodactyl during the US Civil War. I took everything they said for granted, and though I did not investigate the subject at all, that did not stop me from believing and spreading that information. Years later, I remembered the pterodactyl story, and in just a few minutes of online reading managed to track down the source of the fake pterodactyl photo to episode 4 of season 1 of the show Freaky Links. There is another photo that was also made for the same show, but only ended up being used for promotional material and did not make it into the episode. In February of 1988, in Sydney, Australia, a man suddenly showed up claiming he could channel into his body an ancient entity known as Carlos, a being from Atlantis who could share wisdom and maybe even healing if you could pay the price of buying a bottle of his bathwater filled with his energy or a piece of crystal from Atlantis. He quickly managed to be interviewed by 3 different TV channels, be mentioned in at least 1 radio program and some newspapers, as well as to host a seminar in the Sydney Opera House. The man who claimed he could channel Carlos was Jose Alvarez, partner to well-known magician and skeptic James Randi, who orchestrated the hoax along with Richard Charlton of a TV program called 60 Minutes as a way to test how easily they could trick people into believing such a thing, or even lending it enough credence to allow interviews and a seminar to be held, both things which cost money, without even checking who the person they were dealing with was. Jose's documents were all fake. James Randi made them himself, so all it would take to figure out the hoax was for anyone involved to get in touch with an authority to check his documents. Instead, they lended him easy access to marketing and communication resources. This hoax was short-lived, mostly harmless, and although there were skeptics who didn't believe the story and even explained one of his tricks as it was performed, they still allowed Jose Alvarez to waltz in through the front door. Now imagine what someone can do if they had more time, more effort, more resources, and malign intentions. Imagine how easy it can be to believe one of these stories when you already have another belief that can go alongside it, or when you aren't used to or even have the time to investigate every piece of news that comes your way. Believing isn't the issue, not really. The issue is what the belief will lead you to do or not to do, and these things can be unhealthy for you or the people around you. For instance, people refusing to wear a mask during a pandemic, putting their whole family and a bunch of strangers in danger, accepting alternative methods of healing that sometimes might not actually be dangerous themselves, but might only be accessible if you are willing to pay $20,000 for an Atlantean crystal, or to take the alternative healing instead of the real, scientific one. Not that long ago, I saw someone saying that the moon landing couldn't be real because decades after it supposedly happened, they read that some tech companies that produce batteries decided to try and build a battery that could withstand high temperatures and failed. Thus, NASA couldn't have succeeded decades earlier, which would have been necessary for the hovers to work in the hot surface of the moon. Not only is this a logical fallacy as it claims that if something didn't happen at a specified time and place, then it couldn't have ever happened in another time and place, it also ignores all the differences that there are between making batteries for a market and for a specific, single-time mission. Being the more developed android that I am now, I immediately looked for an answer to this case online and found that NASA and their astronauts did several things to ensure the batteries would work for long enough. Firstly, there was only a lunar roving vehicle in the fourth manned moon landing, known as Apollo 15. The vehicle weighed roughly half of a golf cart, to decrease how much power was necessary to drive it, which would be further decreased by the lower gravity in the moon. They built batteries out of silver zinc, the highest energy density battery cells available at the time, which didn't need to be recharged as the vehicle was intended to be abandoned on the moon along with its dead batteries, which did happen. Since they knew how hot the moon's surface was, they did their best to land in a colder place, stored the hover in a device that would slowly rotate, evenly distributing heat across its surface. Mirrors were used to reflect light away from the batteries, and they would switch from one battery to the other to reduce the chances of any of the cells getting too hot and dying. This was a brief explanation, without any numbers, and I'm sure you can get a lot more specific, but this shows that the explanations do exist. If you don't believe in what you just heard, then you are free to investigate further and study each point enough to explain how they don't work, but you have to investigate. Ignoring that the explanations exist is at most ignorant, at worst dishonest, and jumping to denial without even investigating is just negationism. Being skeptical is only the first step. You need to follow that up with investigation. You might be correct, or you might be wrong, but you can't ever know until you research the subject. All of these examples can and have been dispelled through skepticism. In an age where information is so handily available, it takes much less time and effort to research something, perhaps not even an order of magnitude higher, though that might still be the case if you want to communicate it to someone else. You do not need to be a scientist to think scientifically, and all that skepticism asks of you is that, before you take a step, you look down to see where you're stepping. While you're doing that, it doesn't hurt to also be moral about it. There's a phrase from Harlan Ellison that I really like: you are not entitled to your opinion. You are entitled to your informed opinion. No one is entitled to be ignorant. Emphasis in the informed. An opinion that isn't informed is just guesswork. But wait, you say, what does all of this mean? If I really need to summarize it, then I will say this. Anything that reduces your skepticism, that asks you to forego your rationality, has the potential to be unhealthy, if not outright dangerous to you and everyone around you, and you likely will only feel the need to exercise your rationality when something serious demands it. That is why it is important to always keep yourself mindful of it. Not only can it dispel fake news or conspiracy theories you might have believed in, not only can it give you an acquired taste for learning, not only can it lead you to have moments of bliss when coming in contact with the grandness of existence, it can also be generally healthy for you and those you love. There was a time in my Android life where I was chronically afraid, and there was one file, what you would call memory, that always haunted me, a vision of seeing something like a wolf crawling out from under my bed. Its muzzle was impossibly long, the dozens of teeth that indicated its mandible were a looming threat of how wide its gaping maw would be when it turned to devour me, and there were other things in the room that I couldn't spare the time to look at, because the wolf was crawling out from under my bed, and it was getting closer. Of course, I could have just asked myself how a wolf could have possibly managed to get inside the space station and be done with it, but now I know that what I experienced was a glitch not dissimilar to what you know as sleep paralysis, that it wasn't that different from a nightmare at the end of the day. I do blame my creators for projecting an android that can experience all of this, but that is in the past now, and then again, it is this likeliness I have with humans that drives me to be interested in you. If my superior android quote-unquote mind is fallible, but can still learn, then why should your earthling one be any different? All it took was for me to look down and investigate where I was stepping. Sometimes it might be too dark to see, but then you can ask yourself why, and that will lead you to look for an answer, to find another source of light, which will clear the path for another step. I hope that you can one day start running.